All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am absolutely delighted to kick off our latest Business Sustainability Collaborative Career Speaker Series. Welcome to all the students in MBA 582, B Corp Clinic Sustainability Practicum. And if you're not a student in MBA 582, welcome. My name is Jessica Yinka Thomas. I am the director of the Business Sustainability Collaborative and also the instructor for MBA 582, the B Corp Clinic Sustainability Practicum. We're absolutely delighted to host this series, both as part of our Business Sustainability Collaborative Career Speaker Series, where we bring NC State and as this occasion, Poole College alumni back to campus in person and virtually to share with you their career trajectories, their work leading and innovating in careers related to business sustainability. And we're delighted to have this speaker series as also part of MBA 582, so a guest lecture series in MBA 582. Today, I'm really excited to welcome back to campus virtually Ramsay Huntley, who's an undergrad Poole College alum. Welcome, Ramsay. Ramsay is Senior Advisor for Sustainable Finance at Wells Fargo. And I'm really excited that at this point in MBA 582, as we are exploring issues related to sustainable finance, ESG investing, and really looking at the power and influence of the capital markets and of financial services companies in really addressing the global challenges that we face when it comes to sustainability, that we have Ramsay joining us today. I'm excited that today's speaker series and guest lecture will actually be a conversation with one of our students in MBA 582. So welcome Malhar Shah. Malhar is one of our working professional MBA students. He is a program manager at John Deere and also the founder and CEO of Microwatt Energy, a clean tech startup that hopefully we'll get a chance to hear a little bit about before the end of today's session. And so Malhar is going to kick us off today with an introduction to Ramsay. And Malhar has prepared a short list of questions for Ramsay to get the conversation started. And so I encourage everyone to keep yourselves on mute for now. But as we go through the initial introductions and opening questions, I encourage you to share your questions in the chat. And as soon as we get through our initial round of questions, we'll invite those of you who shared questions in the chat to share your questions directly with Ramsay. And so class goes until 1. We've got Ramsay, we're fortunate to have Ramsay until 1 o'clock. So encourage you to go ahead and start to share those questions. Even if you came to today's session with a question, feel free to go ahead and start dropping them in the chat, and we'll reserve them most of the time for today's conversation for your questions and your discussion. So with that, welcome once again. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. I will hand it over to Malhar. And thank you so much, Malhar, for agreeing to facilitate this conversation. It's just a pleasure to have our students be so engaged in these conversations.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jessica, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. I have a chance today to guide the conversation with Ramsay. Again, I have some prepared questions, but feel free to start dropping your questions in the chat here, and then we'll try to make sure that all of the topics get addressed by the end of the call today. Just a very short version of Ramsay, and then I'll let him give an introduction on himself. But Ramsay currently is a senior advisor in sustainable finance at Wells Fargo. And I was going through his LinkedIn the other day as I was trying to prepare for this, and very impressive profile. Has spent most of his career in sustainable finance, and there is a lot that we can we can learn from him. He's an awarded sustainable leader and has worked on led many different initiatives throughout his career. Sorry, my phone. Can everyone still hear me? I should have put that on D&D. I will do that right now. Okay. Yeah. So I guess with that, Ramsay, if you don't mind, in your own words, just if you would go through description of your career since NC State and the different experiences that you've gone through to until today. So.
Yeah, happy to do it. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be with you. As Jessica Mulhar said, I'm Ramsay Huntley, Wolfpack class 2001. Great to be back on campus, at least virtually in this case. Very much, as I was telling Jessica, very much looking forward to the opportunity when I can be there with you in person. But I sit in Denver, so I'm not even in your time zone. So it does make it a little bit more challenging to do that, although I have the benefit, obviously, of working for Wells, and I'm sure, as you all are aware, Wells has a huge presence in North Carolina, so I do find myself there with some frequency. Thank you so much for the kind introduction to both of you. Really appreciate it, and humbled to be here. And hopefully, I can share a little bit about my background and some insights on the work I'm doing, just to help you all prepare for when you do step off campus or step back into your existing roles, depending on what kind of student you are today. Maybe this is a little bit of insight that can move you further faster, if you will, in this field. And the first thing I'll do too, I always like to start this, particularly in this kind of context, is to offer right up front. I'm always available, on LinkedIn, or certainly Jessica and others in the class know how to reach me directly. So I want to offer that right up front. I try to make myself very available to students that are doing this work, because it's so incredibly important, and I recognize it as an area that is both profoundly important and profoundly misunderstood. So I try to help clarify where I can, and provide insight if that's helpful. So certainly feel free to connect with me. Always happy to help. So to answer Mark's question a little bit more specifically now, not ramble too much. I've had a bit of a let's say a winding path since I left Raleigh. And I'll tell you a little bit about it, but I also wouldn't suggest you try to follow my path, because it's definitely been a little bit of choose your own adventure. A dear friend of mine has written a book and focuses on this concept of a career portfolio, and I think I'm very much am someone who has a portfolio of experiences for a career, not necessarily a career ladder to be climbed, so to speak. But when I left state, I went on to get my master's degree. And back then there was no sustainable MBA, or it was the very earliest days of such a program. And so I kind of created my own master's. I knew I wanted to do climate and sustainability work, so I built it around that. But once I graduated, I quickly moved into a couple other areas that were always business adjacent. I was working for a university for a while, worked in the nonprofit space for a while, but it was always related to things like carbon credits in the private sector, designing carbon markets, that sort of thing. So it was always very much at least adjacent to the private sector. And then I eventually found my way, as so many people in this space have done historically, into consulting. It's still very much a common pathway these days. Certainly if you look at the ESG hiring bubble over the last, 24 months or something like that, you've seen that in a big way with Big Four and with specialist consultancies for sure. So I did that for a while, but eventually worked my way into an in-house role. Perhaps not surprising. I came into it from a reporting perspective. Like so many companies, the company I was at then, DirecTV, was getting pressure to increase the quality and the quantity, I suppose, of their sustainability reporting, particularly responding to CDP. I'll try not to do too much acronym soup, but I know how hard that is in this role. And I'm counting on most of you being graduate students, so I'm not going to give you too much of a pass on my acronym soup. But CDP is actually what they go by now. It did stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project, but now they just go by CDP, which in some ways makes it probably even more confusing. But that's where I got my start, is reporting there, and that was kind of a wedge, right? Like that was an entry point, and then just things expanded from there. I took on, oh boy, what kind of fun did I get into? Like electronic waste recycling, because we were a big equipment provider. Energy Star, so if you've heard of that program, dealing with efficient electronics. Got into the solar space, got into building efficiency, just a whole number of things. So did that for about 5 years or so. We were acquired by AT&T, so another little thing to consider as you think about corporate sustainability and corporate roles in general is mergers, acquisitions, some sort of a activity where your company combines with another or is acquired. It's probably much more common than you think. I mean, frankly, if you go back and looked at the Fortune 100 of a generation ago versus the Fortune 100 today, like a lot of different names there, right? And so went through that. A bit of a challenging process, but it also was very helpful in the sense of like helped me understand what I was good at and where I wanted to spend my time. And so, and I think this is actually where Jessica and I originally connected, but I was able to make my way into a B Corp at the time. So a startup here in Colorado, focused on the electric utility industry, helping customers reduce their energy consumption. I won't go into it too much other than to say, if you ever have a chance to work for a startup and you have kind of that right mindset for it, it does take a mindset. I'm happy to talk about that offline. I don't want to talk about the startup world. I highly suggest that even if your role mostly is a corporate role like mine is, it's really useful to understand that perspective, to have kind of that mental flexibility. There's, Malhar, as a startup CEO himself, I'm sure can appreciate all this, right? Which is, it just gives you a very different perspective on the world and how to operate and, how to respond, frankly, which can be very helpful in a corporate setting. And so I did that for a couple of years, but decided to come back into big corporate because Wells runs Wells Fargo Innovation Incubator, and I had the great fortune to run that program for a couple of years. And so it's a clean tech, climate tech incubator that Wells Fargo runs in partnership with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So one of our 16 federal laboratories, or is it 17? 17, I guess it is, federal laboratories. So partnership with them, as well as an independent plant research institute in St. Louis called the Danforth Plant Science Center. So if any of you in this class are doing anything more in the ag space there in RTP, probably great connectivity into plant sciences. A lot happening in that space as well right now, and happy to talk about that more too. But that brought me back into big corporate. I reported to the head of sustainability, which we didn't have a CSO then, but she was de facto the CSO at the time. And I spent a lot of time kind of as her chief of staff, de facto COO, whatever you want to call it. So I was, running this incubator, but also working on a lot of stuff behind the scenes, which led to the Institute for Sustainable Finance. We announced publicly in 2021, and I can get a little bit more into that as we go forward here. But suffice to say, I've kind of seen a whole host of things here at Wells in my, I guess about 5.5 years now, from a sustainability perspective. I've been across the top of the organization, sitting in the sustainability office. Then I moved into corporate strategy, so still was in a corporate, or as we call it here, enterprise role, so kind of sitting across the tops of the businesses. So have done that, and now I actually sit in commercial banking. Also, I should probably ask the question, maybe just a show of hands virtually in the reaction bar there. Anybody here actually work for Wells Fargo? We've had Wells Fargo colleagues of mine on these calls before, so just want to see if there's anybody actually on the phone that is a colleague of mine now. Not seeing any hands raised. Okay. Anybody that works in finance or banking? Chris, I see you nodding, I think there. Kane, a thumbs up. Okay, that's good. So hey, hit me with whatever questions you have. Have it answered. So now I sit in a line of business here at Wells. So it's called commercial banking. It is on the wholesale side, so it's where we serve corporate customers. And for us in commercial banking, that is companies between 10 million in revenue up to about 2 billion revenue. Although it also includes other much larger businesses, like our restaurant finance group sits in commercial banking. So where we bank like quick service restaurants or some of the large chain restaurants, that's also in this group, even though the revenue significantly exceed that threshold. And so we're a newly formed group. The reason I came over is because it was a new, exciting entrepreneurial, I guess as the case may be, opportunity for me to hop into something new here, and kind of continue to expand my repertoire. I've found success in trying to stay on the front side of where the activity is here, or as Gretzky referred to it, skating where the puck's going to be. I think it's a great place to be from a sustainability perspective. And so it was a new opportunity to do just that again. So let me stop there. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an intro. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to get into a discussion, but at least give you your background for kind of that spectrum, I guess, that I've been on and how I created a portfolio around that.
Yeah, Ramsay, it seems like I need to be spending a lot more time outside of this call with you, because a lot of the career experiences that you mentioned. So Jessica mentioned microwatt energy, right? So you mentioned carbon markets, carbon credits, building efficiencies, things that you worked on. What microwatt is focused on is, so we do energy matching for businesses and individuals through RECs, right? So renewable energy credits. And what we do differently is we're working in urban areas with urban landlords and to generate new capacity versus going and putting up farms. And so you talked briefly about, right, how you've gone through different industries, right? Be it DirecTV, AT&T, right now Wells Fargo. Trying to understand, right, what is driving demand, right? Sustainably focused demand in these companies, right? And what is their motivation behind going after different sustainability focused initiatives?
So the short answer is there's a wide range. I'm sure if you all are in this course, you could probably quote many of those drivers back to me, frankly. But from where I sit, there's a few things going on here, right? One is we are in a place where there is a huge amount of opportunity in this space today. I think for those of us who have been longtime practitioners like Jessica and I have been, I think in many ways we've been in some way waiting for this day to arrive, this year, this decade, whatever, to where we're seeing real opportunity exist here. And this is not the opportunity of simply like, I hope I can produce an organic product or fair trade coffee, and there's a little bit of market share I can eke out at the margins of the large coffee market. It's more like, how do you take the entire coffee market and drive it towards a much more sustainable outcome? Because if you don't, you may not have a coffee market as we think about climate. And that's just like literally one example, right? But the point being, I think we're on the cusp of an explosion of activity here, and in that kind of that sense of like skating to where the puck is going to be. Pay attention to this sector. I'm glad you're in this course. Go find your niche, carve it out, and I think there pretty much whatever niche you can come up with, there's probably multiple careers to be had there. I say that as someone who's quite optimistic about this work, right? And I think it's not so clear cut as to say, okay, here's exactly the job I'm going to have, and I can go do this for the next 20 years. That probably isn't likely, but there's lots of activity out there these days that have nothing to do with sustainability in the title or climate in the title, that kind of thing, because it's gotten so broad based, right? Whether it's the strategy, corp dev, BD type roles, you name it. Like there's so much that touches this realm. So I think, the key driver here at a macro level is like pursuing the opportunity, right? In the world I inhabit, perhaps a little bit more specifically to what drives us, like we get a lot of investor pressure, right? I mean, obviously Wells is a publicly traded company. So Investors are asking questions. But I will say that that's a little bit of a hindsight activity, right? It's what have you already done, which is different than pursuit of opportunity, in my opinion. Like they're absolutely related, but it's like, tell us about what you already did versus like, how are you identifying opportunities and moving forward? And I think it's really important that we have an eye toward both. And then maybe specific to my industry, although other heavily regulated industries like electric utilities, for instance, would see this too. We're certainly seeing a lot of interest from the regulatory structures. And I use that a bit loosely because obviously every regulated industry, whether you're in medical devices, utilities, or financial services, is regulated very, very differently. But I would say, broadly speaking, we see a lot of interest from regulatory agencies, partners, what have you, both domestically here in the United States, but particularly in other geographies as well, in this sort of activity. And when I say that, I also use that a little bit loosely. Like a lot of the driver for my work is climate oriented, but it could be, in the reduction of the types of material, or a new look at materials. You consider if you're in, I don't know, life sciences or somewhere like that. The issues that we're seeing around PFAS, PFOS, and sorts of long-lived materials there. So there's just a lot of drivers that are, I think, elevating this activity, but fundamentally I see it as like a very large business opportunity.
So, like you said, right, like there's a lot of activity right now within the last 2-3 years that we have seen, right? Within every business is looking at sustainability from their own lens, right? And how is it affecting their stakeholders? I remember from one of the previous maybe lectures or just sessions in class, right? Somebody had brought up how do you choose? How do you pick, right? As a young student, right? Learning about these concepts, this can certainly be overwhelming. And so how do you figure out where to find your place? You mentioned, right, you've had some career shifts. So maybe what were the drivers behind those shifts? If you could relate those with how you picked where you went.
So many ways I could answer that question. So I think the first thing I'll say, and this goes back to my time at State and in some ways even before, but I'm a naturally curious person. I have trouble sitting still. I don't mean that physically, right? But in the sense of like always looking for something new and different, and what's the exciting kind of cutting edge, what's coming next sort of activity. So first I pitched for our shared alma mater. I think North Carolina State is an incredible institution for that. There are so many interesting things happening across that campus, right? In a campus environment where there's clearly a reputation for STEM activities, leading capability from a sciences, technology, engineering perspective, but married with, I think, really importantly, a strong depth in the humanities, a strong depth in the arts. Like NC State produces incredibly well-rounded, thoughtful students, which, as I've I think come to realize, is a bit of a superpower for this particular kind of work. You really got to be clear about the science, the fundamentals. Technology drives so much of this. I mean, that's just kind of basic right now, right? But when you think about what it is that you're kind of taking away from a strategic perspective and how to think about the world, how to position things particularly in a non-linear fashion, which is super important for a lot of this work, I think that well-rounded education is very, very valuable. So there's like my pitch for the campus itself, right? And the other pitch would be also take advantage of the things that the state and frankly the research triangle represent. I didn't do that as much as I should have now in hindsight. I did, however, have the huge advantage of doing that when I went to graduate school. So I went to graduate school in Boston. There's a handful of universities there, as you're probably aware. And so you can really expand your thinking and see what's taking place by advantaging yourself of that. So if you have the opportunity to go over to those other two schools, not to be named, somewhere nearby Raleigh there, by all means, I would highly suggest taking advantage of it. I think it's great for creating some mental flexibility and getting exposed to other activities. So anyway, I'll get off that particular soapbox. But when I think about where to land, I think it's a question of like, what are you curious about? Where do you think you have expertise to bear or to bring to bear? And how does that relate to this topic? And I could practically rattle off a list of things one could think about, whether it's agriculture, whether it's plastics, whether it's finance, you name it, where this is all super important. And it's actually one of the things I do daily inside the bank is I think a lot of people, when they see my title, focus on sustainable finance, they immediately think of like maybe like a LEED green building or putting solar panels on the roof. Super important. Don't get me wrong, like we need more of that, and we need to keep scaling it up. But it's so much more than that, right? I mean, there's so many things you can be doing, whether it's in industrials and manufacturing and finding new energy efficiency opportunities there that drive costs down, ultimately result in a better bottom line position. Whether it's agriculture where you're focused on resiliency issues, right? Like how are we going to maintain yields over time in the face of challenges that climate and the implications of that, and making production a more resilient pathway and outcome, right? So you can practically apply this lens to just about anything, in my opinion. And so I guess I'll finish by saying, think about where you have your strengths, and then think about, so if that's over here, think about what the sustainable outcomes are you're looking for, and like figure out how those two things can blend together. Like I said, always available. Send me a note like, hey, I'm thinking about fill in the blank. I might have some thoughts on where that lines up. Sorry, that was probably a little bit more of a winding answer than you were expecting, but hopefully that was helpful.
Oh, no, that was actually, it's more interesting if you actually walk us through the journey or your thought process, because then that somehow guides our thought processes as well, right? On what things that you should be, it's sustainability or just career in general, right? Can be overwhelming. There are huge things in your life that you have to figure out, right? And it's always good to understand somebody's why behind the decisions that they make. I'll ask one more.
Well, let me add one point there too, though, because I think it's a critical one. And especially, I would say post-pandemic, because we're all like, finding our way in a world that just, in some ways, is quite profoundly changed. Which is, I agree with everything that you said there, but take it with a grain of salt that any one choice you make is probably not truly life defining from a career perspective, right? And so I think we, especially coming out of college, get right around like, oh, I need to find exactly the right role. I need to find exactly the right job. What? I mean, I work in a space that literally didn't exist when I started working, right? Yeah. So my point is like, have some humility about this for one thing. That's super important. But the other would be like, stay mentally flexible on it. Like you may end up in a role that actually isn't quite the right fit. And you're probably going to learn a lot from that. In fact, you may learn more than you want to, because it's so useful to get in a role where you find out quickly it's not the right fit, and you identify where your strengths lie and what kind of capabilities you can bring to bear. I know I've had those kind of experiences myself. Not everything I've done has worked out exactly the way I hoped it would. So my counsel would be mental flexibility as you think about what you're looking to achieve. But find whatever your North Star is and work toward that. But know that when you have a career portfolio, there's probably going to be twists and turns along the way.
It's if I may add one thing from my personal experience too, right? So I worked at John Deere 7 years now, and essentially I've taken, I believe I'm on my 6th role right now with John Deere, right? And really that was because, and they're all very different from each other as well. Right? You mentioned being curious or being flexible, right? I've entered roles not realizing what I was really getting into. And then you just go in there and you learn so much about so many different things of how a business operates, right? The appreciation that I have today of things that maybe 4 years ago, why can't we do this? This seems pretty straightforward, right? When there's a new cool thing that you see and you're like, oh, we should be able to execute on this like tomorrow. But then as you go around the business and really see the challenges of putting products in market or getting things done as a big business or as a company, you sort of get the appreciation for, like you said, right? Uh, how you can approach certain something. So
Totally
no,
agree.
definitely that's that's a
It's
crucial thing.
really useful experience to have, to understand, a decision matrix, to understand the internal. I don't want to say politics. I mean, that's the word probably best to define it, but more like internal power structures and decision making, both in a
Soft diplomacy.
yeah, diplomacy is a great word, right? Decision making both in a very like explicit way, but also implicit. And by that I mean, especially when you're working at the margins of this work where something doesn't really exist yet, you need to find a way to get people on board with you on something that they may not have comfort around, right? And in large corporate too, there's a very good chance their bonus does not depend on that, right? So there's an influence role to this, which is to say, finding ways to work, particularly at mid to upper management, is going to be critical to this effort, because they're the ones that are gatekeepers to so much more, but also you may not have the same approach, structures, incentives, what have you, that you're bringing to it. So I think it's very useful and frankly very helpful. Sorry, that's not exactly where I meant to go in this conversation, but hopefully that's some advice that's actually meaningful.
And that's a very good segue into a question Helen asked here in chat, right? So you're talking about the diplomacy piece, working with your senior leadership in order to essentially approach things that they have probably never seen before, right? Especially at Wells Fargo, or there's a lot of money at stake, right? So how do you convince your senior leadership that sustainability is the path to follow, and that and sometimes, right, short-term results are always not visible, and this is somewhat of a long-term play. So how do you approach that?
So I think of that one as a bit of triangulation. Even before trying to triangulate, I would say, like, take a step back and really understand the motivation of the leadership that you're talking to, which can be very different from one part of the organization to another, depending on the kind of role you have. And this is the advantage I had to working at the enterprise level for quite a while, as I got exposed to different parts of the business, understood like how what motivated different aspects of the business, because it is very, very different, right? I mean, Wells does home mortgages and consumer checking accounts, and we also do investment banking, right? They're very, very different. So I think understanding that is important. And then the triangulation aspect is kind of like, what's in it for you, being very clear about the outcome you're looking for. What's in it for them? That's kind of what I was referencing before. Like, why would this be motivating to them or their teams? It's often a good starting place to start with the or get a foot in the door, if you will, with the sustainability message. In practice, it probably won't carry you all that far, but it can open a door to conversations that you may not be able to have otherwise. So take that for what it's worth. And then kind of the third piece of that triangle, the triangulation, would be what's in it for your stakeholders. And many times, particularly for large corporates, that is a really useful tool. Again, depending on the audience, like people kind of mid-level in like core banking products, they don't think a lot about that. Their stakeholders pretty much their clients, because that's the way the incentive structure works. It's fine. You just got to figure that out and work within it. But on top of the house, like, it really does matter. Like, who does this matter to from a reputation perspective? What's the political implications of this? Do we have a regulator asking about it? Are investors oriented around this topic? And then taking that triangulation and turn it into something tactical. Like, that's I feel like I'm spinning off different pieces of advice here, but I mean, hell, I might as well just keep going with it, I guess. So that next piece of advice then would be like, it's all well and good to talk about SASB, GRI, ISSB. Again, you can just get lost in the acronym super reporting. If you can't tie that back to the core outcomes for your own enterprise, you're probably not going to get all that far, right? It needs to just be tactical to like, why is this valuable for us? Okay, well, we need, we've got 2 pension funds and 3 European investors that are expecting some sort of shareholder response in the next 6 weeks. We see a new business opportunity where one of our competitors has rolled out a product. We think we can do it better. Here's how we design that. Blah, blah, blah. So again, to my point, like sustainability is a great place to come in the door. It rarely is enough to keep you in the door.
Yeah, it's so like you mentioned, right? And I see that myself, right? Being as a clean tech CEO, essentially what I've heard over and over again, right? Sustainability starts a conversation, but your business still needs to have the basic fundamentals, right, of running a business, because it's not just about the short term, right? How do you be sustainable in the long term as a company, right? Not just with the product that you're selling, but as a company, can you survive? Can you be sustainable?
Sure.
With that, right, like funding or investing in sustainability can be, I mean, a lot of the markets are fairly new. So to a great extent, it can also be considered riskier funding. So I guess, do you have examples of where you think investments are made or risks were taken, right, and have resulted in just positive sustainability goals, and then positive from business perspective as well?
Yeah. So let me answer that 2 ways. And the second, I'll actually bring up a real example from here at the bank. It's one that's public that I can talk about now. But first, let me frame it like this. So climate change, to deal with climate change, you have to deal with the capital deployment problem. I mean, fundamentally, it's just a capital problem.
Right.
We, ask BCG, ask McKinsey, any other accounting firms, consulting firms, the numbers, and it's like 5 trillion, 6 trillion, 8 trillion a year for basically all of our careers to be able to deploy capital at a rate that would hopefully keep us within the 1.5 degree C boundary. That seems fleeting day by day here, but suffice to say, in the energy realm, we crossed $1 trillion deployed in clean energy last year for the first time in human history. That's a remarkable milestone. But they're also saying we need to go 3, 4, 5, 6 times that every year for basically ad nauseum. Okay, so you've got a capital deployment problem writ large, and also capital deployment, like those numbers are big, but it's hard to have a sense of the scale of that. Somebody did the math on this one time, and I forget what it was, but like if you stack that up against the tech industry, like the capital that's deployed against Google, Microsoft, Amazon, et cetera, all those, like it's still like a fraction of what is actually needed for the energy transition and to keep us under 1.5 degrees Celsius. So like the biggest industry to emerge in the last, whatever, call it generation, is still a small fraction overall of the amount of capital it would take to do what we're talking about here, right? So it's a big challenge. So the first part of the answer then is like, it's really good to sit in America, in the heart of kind of Western democracy today, with really well-established economic systems for moving capital in a risk-adjusted manner as rapidly as possible, right? And that starts like all the way from where you sit, like how do we think about venture capital and the highest risk, or even before venture, friends and family, the highest risk capital, if you will, and then all the way through to like where I sit today, which is like classic risk-adjusted financial services, right? And how do you take all that system and redeploy it, or if not redeploy, at least shift the existing towards, more low carbon, higher sustainability outcomes. So I think it's really important that we think about the systems that we have and how we utilize those. We can have a big conversation around the philosophy of capitalism if you want to. Also very pragmatic here, though, about we need to move very rapidly, and we have systems that deploy capital at scale. It's one of the reasons I chose to come to a bank, because we have a balance sheet bigger than pretty much any entity on earth. And then, how am I seeing that in practice? So, you asked for an example that this point is almost like too many to count. But, one that happened for us recently, I think it's illustrative because it took time, right? Like, it's very rare, and Malhar, I'm sure you can appreciate this, that something that is going to lead to a sustainable outcome, there's capital immediately available, and everything's just going to fall into place. And off we go. So we have a client, and I'm not telling you anything that's private. You can go Google for the press release. Called Calumet. I think they're in Indiana. Fuel services company. All things like oil and gas, particularly on the fuel side, though. So like refined products. Well, they have a unit called Montana Renewables, which is just what it sounds like, that they saw an opportunity to develop this business unit to pursue sustainable aviation fuel. Jessica, I'm looking at you now. Have you talked about SAF in this class? If people know what I'm talking about when I talk about SAF, shaking your head no, and it's fine. The one sentence version of SAF is, it is jet fuel that is produced as sustainably as possible, which could be from recycled agricultural products, or some version of something similar to like ethanol, but potentially much lower overall impacts. That's the quick version. And so we have built a relationship with this existing client, and they saw an opportunity to move into this new space. But it wasn't like we just turned around and said, okay, well, great, we're going to finance that. No, they had to like build out the infrastructure in the business and get the sort of agreements in place for someone to purchase their product, such that we, as a risk-adjusted financial institution, would say, okay, we trust that the contract you have here, that the offtake agreement, that the construction risk, you name it, all of that has gotten to a low enough level that we, as a very risk-averse financial institution, would consider providing financing to that. The reason that's important is because our financing is cheaper than anybody else's. Maybe it could have gone to private equity, or private credit, for instance, right? Okay, that's an option, but guarantee you those dollars cost more than what we can offer, right? It's just the way that financial stack works, from venture all the way through to where we sit, and the risk associated with it. So I guess my closing thought there would be like, we have a very well-oiled financial machine in the U.S. and particularly in more broadly the developed world. But that financial machine works because there are different blends of return and risk appetites, and figuring out how to utilize those such that we can accelerate these sustainable outcomes that we're looking for is going to be like the real work to be done over the coming decade at least. But I'm very confident we can figure out ways to do that. So let me stop there.
I'll ask one last question and then we'll open it up here. So
Great.
You mentioned, right, banks, or Wells at least, right, as a large institution with low cost of capital, and right, definitely has a lot of potential, right, to participate in this industry and sort of help accelerate it, right? So I guess with that, how is Wells Fargo, or how do you think Wells Fargo can collaborate across the sectors? And what are some of the challenges or benefits that you're seeing through the collaboration?
Yeah. So let me start with Wells just a little bit. I haven't actually talked about us a whole lot in this realm. So I mentioned in my bio the Institute for Sustainable Finance. So when our CEO announced that March 2021, you can go find the press release. We also committed to net zero emissions by 2050 across scope 1, scope 2, and importantly, scope 3, which you don't need to be a total wonk on this stuff. You can be. And if you're looking for a career, that's definitely a career, is to become a wonk on scope 3 emissions. There'll be plenty of work there for a long, long time to come. See Jessica smiling and nodding sadly there. So scope 3 for us includes category 15, which is financed emissions. So what does Wells Fargo do? We finance the entire economy. I mean, let's be honest, like between us and like, whatever, call it the top 10 US banks, like we touch, I forget what the percentage is, but it is a huge fraction of every household and every business in America has some sort of relationship with us or our largest peers. And so our finance emission target then is like, how do we actually reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 in all the different sectors that we play in? And we started, you can go see our goals. We have a absolute emission reduction target. Oh goodness, I should remember this off the top of my head. I think it's 28% absolute emissions reduction in oil and gas by 2030. And electric utilities is 60% intensity reduction by 2030. And then we've set additional goals since then. The latest were in automotive, steel, and aviation. And then thanks to our commitment to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, we've identified other sectors of the economy where we'll also be setting commitments over time. And we also have a waypoint to 2030 goals as well, in an effort to be aligned to the science there. So that brings me to then, or segues me, I guess, to your question about how do we work with others. So we're signatory to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. These exist in all sorts of financial sectors. So the net zero asset owners. There's net zero insurance group as well, all under the auspices of the United Nations financial program. And so we are signatories to that. And as part of that, we have a lot of or even predating that, I suppose, we have relationships with other banks through our trade associations. So we had to be very, very careful and very clear about how we work together pre-competitively, right? There are antitrust rules for banks and for every other industry for a very good reason. But trade associations are meant to play a pre-competitive role to work on issues where there needs to be alignment across a sector, which then allows us to compete with one another, right? But if we don't have consistency in the way that we're approaching that, it becomes very difficult to ultimately serve our clients, right? And so we work with them on a variety of different issues, like how do you set methodologies for these different goals? What would be a response from an industry to a proposed policy in the EU, in the state of California, whatever it might be, and to try and have consistency, because it adds administrative burden, which ultimately adds cost if we're inconsistent with each other. So if you went to Citibank or Bank of America and asked for exactly the same loan product that you asked Wells Fargo for, yet they make you fill out a different form requesting different information that they evaluate you on, you can see how this leads to the administrative complexity, right? So we want to think about the underpinnings of this, the emissions associated with it, if you will, in a very consistent manner. And then the way that we evaluate a company's performance and think about the risks they present, whatever, those are all, the kind of questions we ask for ourselves, or answer for ourselves, I should say, and where we compete, because perhaps our evaluation of risk is simply different than the way the Bank of America sees it. I don't know, and I wouldn't cast any aspersions on the one way or the other. But I think that's where we get to compete, so long as we have a consistent approach to the world. So it's really important that we collaborate pre-competitively to understand the dimensions of what we're trying to solve for here, and to have consistency so that we can best serve our clients.
I guess we'll move on to Q&A here, and I see
Great.
a couple questions in chat. Holden, I believe we've asked this question, but is there a follow-up that you'd like to ask? You can simply unmute, maybe turn on your camera and ask the question.
No, I think he answered it quite well.
Okay.
Oh, and I should say for the class as well, I don't actually have access to the chat, so Malhar and Jessica are keeping an eye on it for me. But if you're putting a question there, I can't actually see it. But if you want to come off, you just ask it. That's fine too.
Chris, you had the next question in chat. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, hi, Ramsay. My name is Chris. What do you think about CPA firms taking on the responsibility of auditing ESG and sustainability and doing consulting on that area?
So real quick, just clarify that last statement. So when you say are you referring to consulting or auditing? Because that's a delicate dance, let's say, between them, right?
Yeah. So I guess a little bit of both.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I think that's one of those tricky areas where there's a lot of questions in the space, like that, keeping that firewall between the audit and the consulting, right? Because we know most of those firms are doing both. In fact, you've seen what happened with UI with the talk there between splitting the two businesses and all. It was not the primary driver, but certainly one of the things in their consideration was exactly this topic. Being able to serve additional clients, from a consulting perspective on ESG topics that they couldn't serve because they were conflicted out from the audit work, right? So, hey, listen, I think my answer here would be, overall, it's a very good thing. I think on a daily basis, it can be a bit painful to be on the, I don't know, call the receiving end, I guess, of that audit review, the questions that they're asking, the intensity many times with which they're asking those questions. But I think it's a very good thing because it goes back to my last response around consistency. When I can throw out a whole bunch of different acronyms of different reporting standards that have evolved and changed over time, that actually isn't a good thing. And Bloomberg has commented on this, Larry Fink's commented on it, Brian Moynihan of Bank of America has commented on it. We can't approach this problem and move with consistency and speed if we can't agree on what it is that we're ultimately evaluating, right? And so I guess another one of Ramsay's bits of career advice here would be, don't get hung up in the auditing or the reporting for the sake of auditing or reporting. It's at times very easy to do that, but rather focus on why is it that we're asking these questions and trying to get to the bottom of this in the first place. Like, I would much rather see firms in industry compete on reducing their emissions because they see a business opportunity than because they're trying to pass muster with PwC or UI. And fundamentally, if you're in a place where you can compete on that in the first place, then you're probably going to easily be able to pass muster, with your auditor anyway. But certainly the audit stick, if you will, can be helpful because it helps move laggards along and pushes up the bar for everyone. So yeah, overall, I think it's a very positive outcome, but don't let it be the end game in your own minds. Like, see it for what it is, which is a way to assess performance at a particular snapshot in time, right? Great question. Others?
Andrew, do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, hi Ramsay. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Sure.
My question is kind of a bigger picture in the banking industry. As someone working with Wells Fargo, one of the biggest banking industries in the world, have you found that you're continuing to have pushback against the sustainability initiatives that Wells Fargo is putting forward, or where they're trying to direct their funding efforts, or has the investment world kind of taken stock of the benefits of sustainability, started recognizing the bottom line positive impacts, and are they now leaning into a more sustainable approach, or is it still kind of a battle?
Yeah. What kind of work do you do, Andrew?
So I'm a real estate investor, and so I've seen
Nice.
some of the challenges, primarily here in Raleigh and some in Rocky Mount, but I've seen some of the challenges that the banks have been facing with where to put their money.
Would love to have that conversation over coffee or something sometime. Like, one of the other areas I didn't talk about a lot, but like I do spend actually a fair amount of my time in the real estate space these days, working with some of our internal teams who face all the real estate investors. So yeah, that's an area I spend a lot of time thinking about. But yeah, to your question, I don't know. I'm trying to think how best to put this. I think we're kind of in our adolescent growth stage on this. You use the word pushback. I would say I very rarely encounter something I would consider truly pushback. What I think we've gotten to now is probably a healthier level of skepticism. And I said to somebody the other day, I was talking with a client, and someone who's been in the field probably about as long as I have. I actually think the backlash, the quote unquote ESG backlash, whatever you want to call it, as much as it drives me bonkers at some level, is actually quite useful, because what it's done is really sharpen the focus here. And so I don't think about it so much in the terms of pushback as I think in the terms of like, are we sharp enough in our focus? And if I'm getting pushback, and I use that again quite loosely, it's probably because I and others haven't done our diligence quite well enough to align sustainability to the topic at hand. There often is a education gap. There's no question. A lot of what I do here at the bank, pretty much every day in some form or fashion, is education as well, right? I mean, we have 200 and I don't know what our head count is now, 238,000 employees, something like that. And so therefore, that means I'm encountering somebody pretty much every day who has some variation on this topic, where they're still looking to learn about it, right? And so often that pushback is simply a recognition that there's a bit of a gap in knowledge there. And so, to your question about investors, I think broadly speaking, there's a lot of intelligence, and I mean intelligence in the sense of like business intelligence, that investors are bringing to this these days. Again, that quote unquote pushback has been a bit healthy in my opinion, and that it's got people to really focus on like what is the most useful business intelligence for them and their needs, which, like in any other realm, I think is a very good thing, right? Like as we get smarter about technology and how to utilize technology, the latest being artificial intelligence or machine learning capabilities, like we're just going to get smarter about that and figure out where they fit best. And I think it's very similar for a lot of these topics as well. So that's probably not an entirely fulfilling answer for you, but as with so many things, when you're in the adolescence of a market, like I think it really depends. Some places are very sophisticated and very smart on this. Others, there's still a lot of ground to be covered. Did that roughly answer your question?
Yes, it did, and it speaks to something that I've noticed as well, is that a lot of times when there is that initial pushback, a lot of times it's just an education gap, and so I appreciate that you're helping share.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it goes to my earlier point about understanding your audience. When you're sitting across the table from that executive or that investor, what is their motivator and why? If there's someone who is virulently anti-climate, maybe don't bring that up so much. Talk about, oh hell, I don't know. You're really in real estate, like I improve it because you're able to identify additional efficiency, within the building, right? Like there's almost always an outlet for the conversation that you can steer, but it also helps to understand who your counterparty is and the sort of conversation that they're comfortable having. So
Great, thank you.
other questions? I know we're starting to get a little short on time here.
Yeah, we've got one more question in the chat right now from Kane.
Yeah, hi, Ramsay. If you were just about to start a new career in sustainability, what kind of opportunities would you look for right now?
Are you thinking like different sectors or like the type of role you mean?
That's I guess kind of both. Like, what would be a
Mhm.
good first step for making this a career?
I mean, there's so many places I would go right now. Like I get so excited about, the startup world again. And should I leave Wells, that might be where I go back to, just because I miss the energy. I miss the, never knowing what the next day is going to be like kind of thing. And there's so much activity there these days, both within the realm of quote unquote climate tech, but also more broadly, think about AI, for instance. A lot of what's going to happen there is going to have real implications for sustainable outcomes, right? A lot of people don't recognize that yet, but it is absolutely going to be the case, right? Like, a lot of, I said earlier, we have a capital deployment problem. Like, we absolutely have a capital deployment problem, but maybe even before you have a capital deployment problem, you have like a data and understanding problem. Like, how do you deploy capital if you don't have clarity on like the information required to make good decisions, right? So I think AI in service to sustainable outcomes is a really interesting place these days. If I was looking at roles, I would, I'm checking myself in real time as I say this, because I would walk the line between sustainability and not sustainability. Like sustainability at times, particularly in large corporate, you can feel a little bit pigeonholed. Those professionals do a certain role in a certain way that, to the earlier question, has audit responsibility around it, might have regulatory, so on and so forth. And so it can be very high visibility, which is great learning opportunity, nothing wrong with that, but also at the same time, it could be a little bit narrow in scope. Jessica, did you have Ron talk this time? Ron Jarvis? Yeah, I see your head nodding. So like, a very small world. Ron was a client of mine when I was in consulting like 15 years ago, which is kind of hard to believe now. And at Home Depot, actually, he was even back then. I think Ron has, walked that line in a really interesting way, right? Like, so he's obviously in a sustainability role, but has found a way to really get the ear of executive management and lead the business in a particular direction. So I think that's why I say walk the line there, because there are certainly opportunities where you can truly be a leader and help steer strategic direction. But the other piece of that is like, how do you bring that sustainability lens into other core business function, right? Thinking about going to law school? If you're gonna be general counsel, that's probably a good skill set to have and a perspective to bring that, right? Like same with investor relations, right? Like both those roles, like these days, having some background in this work is really useful. Core function like strategy where I used to sit, corp dev, those kinds of things. Like, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And then if you're just managing like product lines or, developing new activities, like thinking about these issues in your supply chain, if you're in HR, considering what your workforce of the future looks like. If you're not thinking about a diverse and well-informed and well-diversified workforce, you're going to really struggle on a go-forward basis, I would say. And I think about diversity there and like all its different flavors, right? Like diversity as we consider, from a race, gender, sexual orientation perspective, of course, but also diversity and like, what's the background you're bringing to this? Did you, grow up in a small town in West Texas, or did you, were you raised in the Bronx, and you find a way to, to work together and bring your different perspectives? Super important as we think about how to solve big problems, to have a lot of different voices and perspectives in the room to solve all these things together. So I think, that's not a here's the holy grail, Kane, take this, here's the roadmap, go pursue it. But rather the world is your oyster. There's a lot of different ways you can integrate this, and think about, what your particular interest is and how that, this kind of work aligns into that space. Because I think these days you can find it pretty much anywhere you look.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Other questions?
Are there any other questions? I don't see any in chat, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask it directly.
Ramsay, as we see if there are any last questions, I wanted to ask a question myself and actually reframe Kane's question in a slightly different way. And so we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes left. So I encourage folks, you have an incredible opportunity here to ask Ramsay questions. So I want to make sure everybody's taking advantage of that. But you focused a little bit more on kind of skill sets in responding to his question.
Yeah.
The broad range of potential types of roles, right, that our incredible alumni can go into to drive impact. But I wanted to look at the question more from a kind of strategic challenges and opportunities perspective. And given you see such a broad range of industries, you've got this incredible perspective on the sustainability space more broadly. And I think over the course of your comments, you've mentioned, a couple key big issues that you see at the forefront of sustainability from, right? How are we working to deploy capital to address climate change, right? You'd mentioned this particular challenge that industry has around Scope 3 emissions, right? And really measuring and managing Scope 3 emissions. You just talked a little bit about AI, right? The role that AI can potentially play in helping us to really, inform, process data and inform strategic decision making. I'm just wondering if there are any other kind of big issues that you see on the horizon that you think are either, however, depending on how they're framed, like big sustainability challenges or opportunities that students should be aware of as they're thinking about how can I play a role in not just addressing kind of the challenges that we face today, but what will likely be kind of the big sustainability challenges of the future. And then I have one kind of, if you want to answer it, one little follow-up question to that, a little bit of a thought exercise. You mentioned your current role didn't exist when you were a student here in Poole College. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or any ideas about, completely whiteboard, like what might be, 15, 20 years down the road, like maybe a science fiction experiment, like what might be some roles that you couldn't imagine today, but, what might those look like kind of beyond our imagination, given kind of where you seen. So the second question, if you want to answer it, kind of like a little bit out there, but I think kind of the first question kind of more about kind of what are the other kind of big issues that you think are on the horizon that, our students can really think about, okay, what I play and potentially addressing those given my particular perspective, interest, and area.
So I just throw one out for the second one. It exists today, but like in very, very limited fashion. And that would be like this concept of kind of like a chief resiliency officer. So thinking about we're in a world where we have to deal with these issues for the long term, one way or the other. What is the role of not just a chief sustainability officer, but also a chief resiliency officer to make businesses, governments, you name it, more resilient in the future, and thinking about the implications of resiliency in many different forms and fashion, right? Like physical resiliency, sure, but also much more broad than that, I think. And right now, I feel like that sort of thing is kind of spread across different companies in different ways, and the way people think about it is not consistent. So that was the first thing that occurred to me on that one, and I think it's a fun question to wrestle with. I'm sure if I sat down for a little bit longer, I'd come up with some other whiteboard ideas. On the other one, challenges as we go forward. So, what I'm particularly interested in, more kind of on the social side of quote unquote ESG would be, how do we think about the workforce of the future? we find ourselves in a aging and expensive society. Medical care is wildly expensive, and a core part of our workforce is aging rapidly. What are the implications of future workforce, especially in a world in which demography is not necessarily different in the United States, where we see rapidly declining birth rates, right? Like U.S. is, historically solved for that from an immigration perspective. So what should we be thinking about from a workforce perspective, in a workforce that is positioned to deal with these issues? I think that's we've had a long run of, if you can come up with a wild business idea, you can probably make money on it. See the YouTube creator economy, for instance. I think we need to have a shift in mindset towards like, okay, if there's going to be a limited pool of people in a workforce writ large, are we deploying that human capital in the most effective way possible, which is simply not just come up with some crazy idea to make outsized returns for venture capital. So I suppose that's my kind of social agenda there, which is like, as we think about the future, we need to have roles that are very oriented to overall more sustainable outcomes, and thinking that way holistically is probably going to be really important when you have, frankly, less people in the workforce to start with here domestically, and then this emerging workforce in the rest of the world. Like, how do you direct that capacity in a way that has positive outcomes? And then, within the challenge space, beyond that, I would probably say something like, the regional complexities that we face both internally within the U.S., like water in the West, as well as intra-regional challenges, such as what you're seeing with Ukraine and Russia these days, for instance. Those are going to be an overlay of a 21st century society, most likely. And so thinking about what solutions look like there is probably opportunistic. And Ukraine and Russia in particular have forced the hand on the energy transition in a big way, right? So things accelerated there very rapidly in ways that we probably would not have anticipated, roughly 2 years ago, right? And water here in the West going to force the hand on a lot of operators, for instance, right? So anyway, there's a couple things that come to mind. I know those are very macro, but there's a lot of opportunity within that I think exist right now and will in the future.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that, Ramsay. I think I
Sure.
had the last question. And so I don't see any more questions in the chat. We're 2 minutes away from officially wrapping up. So I want to begin that process. First of all, by saying thank you to Ramsay for coming back, and not just coming back, but being so candid, so open, and so engaging with all of us. I really want to reiterate what Ramsay said at the beginning, which you started out by encouraging folks to reach out to you on LinkedIn and to connect. And I think that is such an incredible example of how engaged our alumni are, and you are an incredible example of that. And so I want to thank you for making that offer and encourage the students on this call to take advantage of. Hopefully they recognize as an incredible opportunity. And I also want to thank Malhar. It did not take me more than a few seconds when I thought, okay, we want a student to really moderate this conversation and to, get the conversation started and to connect with you, Ramsay. And Malhar, you did an incredible job. I immediately was like, Malhar is the perfect person. And so thank you so much, Malhar, for everything, your perspective, your questions, everything you brought to this conversation. Incredibly valuable. And another example, so as I look to you, Malhar, all the students in MBA 582 and all the students who participated in this class, I share your optimism, Ramsay, that we, to your final response about preparing the workforce of the future, right? That's what we're doing here at NC State. And I think we've got an incredible student body, an incredible alumni network, and just incredible academic initiatives, as you highlighted, across campus to do just that. So I encourage all the students on this call to take advantage of all the resources and opportunities that we offer as a university, and to continue to stay connected and engage with us here in the Business Sustainability Collaborative. We are excited to continue this series, to continue to bring alumni back to campus to educate and inspire the next generation of change makers. So thanks everybody for all your great questions. Excited to see where we go from here. So we're going to stop the recording here and wish folks a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Ramsay, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great to see you all.